to his son Jim and said, "Are there any Muslims in this hospital?" Jim was surprised by the question. He was knocked off balance a bit by it. But he said, "Yes, Dad, I'm sure there are." Jim he wanted to do. Bennett had one more thing he wanted to do. He turned to his son Jim and said, "Are there any Muslims in this hospital?" Jim was surprised by the question. He was knocked off balance a bit by it. But he said, "Yes, Dad, I'm sure there are." Jim remembers his father was very emotional when he then said, "I want to go up to every single one of them and apologize. I want to go up to every single one of them and tell them how grateful I am that they are in this country and apologize on behalf of the Republican Party for Donald Trump." Bob Bennett served 3 terms as a United States Senator from Utah. Bob Bennett was following in his father's footsteps to the Senate. Wallace Bennett served as a Republican senator from Utah from 1951 to 1974. Bob Bennett's first elected office was student body president at the University of Utah. He leaves his wife Joyce, 6 children, and 20 grandchildren. Joining us now is the son of former Senator Bob Bennett, Jim Bennett. Jim, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Appreciate the opportunity, Lawrence. Thank you.
Jim, please tell us that story of that moment when your father turned to you and said this, and how you were surprised by it, and what you then learned about his thinking.
Well, I think you described it pretty well. It was surprising, and we were on the lookout for whether or not my father was going to be confused or lose some mental capacity after a stroke. So when he asked, "Are there any Muslims in this hospital?" it seemed like a non sequitur. And we were a little concerned, but it was very clear that he had an agenda in mind, and he said, "I want to walk up to every single one of them and thank them for being in this country and apologize on behalf of the Republican Party for Donald Trump." And as I've been telling the story, I was talking to my mother, and she pointed out that this was not something that was brought on by the stroke, that when he was traveling to Utah over Christmas, he walked up to a woman in the airport who was wearing a hijab and said, "I'm grateful that you're in this country and I want to apologize on behalf of the Republican Party." So this was a concern of his, not just as he lay dying, but in the last few months of his life.
Do you have any idea what the reactions were from some of the Muslims who your father approached?
I don't. I do know that he received a number of wonderful messages from people, including people in the Muslim community here in Utah, who thanked him very much for reaching out when he obviously had a number of other things that he could have been thinking about during that time. So the reaction has been very positive from the people who have heard his statement while he was in the hospital.
I just want to help people picture this, because your father, who I served in the staff of the Senate while your father was there,
oh, really?
and I can tell you that, I know you've heard this from everyone, that he had 100% respect of everyone in the body as a man of dignity and kindness and grace, and it didn't matter whether people had political disagreements with him. There wasn't a person there who didn't like and respect him, but he was a real giant of a man. He towered over me. What was he, 6'6" or something?
He was 6'6", yes.
But this very gentle but gigantic and imposing figure, and I'm just picturing him maybe leaning down to have some of these conversations with people in the last year.
Yeah, I can see how that might have been somewhat intimidating, but I think you're absolutely right. Both the Senate Majority Leader and Senate Minority Leader spoke at his funeral in Washington. And I think that was a tribute to the fact that he was respected all across the aisle, and the people who knew him recognized him as a very thoughtful and reasonable person, regardless of his political ideology.
And like you and your father, you as Mormons, you do missionary work at a certain point in your late teens or early 20s at the latest. And I've been wondering today, does that kind of missionary work, which is a unique commitment to young Mormon men, does that change your view, do you think, of the world and the different people in the world?
I think it does. I think it puts you in an environment when you're a young man to have to deal with the world in a way that you wouldn't otherwise if you were staying home. And I certainly think that the teachings of the church, particularly lately, the church has put tremendous emphasis on helping refugees. And so many of the refugees that have been impacted by the crises around the world are of the Muslim faith. And also Mormons, I think, have a cultural cultural reminiscence of the way that we were persecuted back in the early days of the church, and I think that that parallel was inspiring to my father and had a great deal to do with his concern for how Muslims are being treated today.
Jim, if your father was with us today, where do you suppose he would be in Republican politics today? I mean, we have a Never Trump movement. We have people who are like Paul Ryan who say they're trying to find their way to Trump. Your father's old friend Bob Dole has come to grips with Trump, endorsed him basically. Where do you think your father would be?
I think he'd be a Never Trumper. I don't think he's ever used a hashtag before, but if he did, I think it would be a Never Trump hashtag. But we are a family that believes that this life is not the end, and I think he's in a place now where he's very grateful that he doesn't have to make that decision.
Jim Bennett, it was an honor to know your father, and I'm very glad you were able to join us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Up next, a new ad calls